In 1969, there was a gentle knock on the door of a mental hospital in America. With eyes full of fear and exhaustion, the person standing in front of the door spoke of the voices that kept echoing in his head. These voices were emptiness and hollow, repeating words like boom and occasionally echoing thud. After a brief assessment, this person was considered mentally ill and hospitalized for treatment. However, shortly after admission, the patient reported that the voices had completely disappeared and that he was feeling much better. The hospital staff did not take this statement seriously, as it was impossible for a patient to get better in such a short time. So they continued to hospitalize and medicate this person who in fact had no mental illness for 3 weeks. And how do I know that this person did not have a mental illness? Because this person was David Rosenhan, a professor of psychology at Stanford University. Rosenhan knocked on this door because of an experiment he was conducting. He trained himself and 7 friends to be fake patients. These fake patients would be sent to different mental hospitals in America and follow the same procedure. They would go to the hospitals and say that they were hearing voices, and if they were admitted to the hospital, they would act normal, stating that after a short period of time, all symptoms had disappeared. During this time, they would observe how professional psychologists and psychiatrists evaluated them. In total, this team of 8 people went in and out of 12 different mental hospitals in this way. The fake patient who was discharged the soonest was only in the hospital for 7 days, while the patient who stayed the longest was in the hospital for 52 days, even though he showed no symptoms and repeatedly stated that he was not ill. And these hospitals were not just any hospitals. Some were high-end city hospitals, and one was even one of the most expensive private hospitals in the field. In these hospitals, 7 of the 8 fake patients were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the last one with manic depressive psychosis, now known as bipolar disorder. What was remarkable, however, was that none of the specialists realized that these patients were imposters. But there was someone who recognized the fraud: other mental patients in the hospital. A total of 35 of the 118 mental patients with whom these 8 people interacted said that these people were not really patients, but either imposters or undercover officers who had come to inspect the hospital. In other words, the mentally ill were able to diagnose what the experts could not. The 8 fake patients were hospitalized for a total of 129 days, during which time they were given 2,100 medications. These included antidepressants like Elavil, antipsychotics like stelazine, nausea medication like Compazin, and mood stabilizers like Thorazine. Although the disease was the same, there were gaps between the drugs prescribed. Of course, the fake patients did not drink these drugs and secretly poured them down the toilet. Interestingly, none of the hospital staff noticed this. Worse, observers saw caregivers swearing at patients and even beating them. Care was almost non-existent. The average time fake patients were treated by specialists was only 7 minutes a day. This was not even one-on-one time, including hospitalization interviews, mass meetings, case presentation conferences, and group sessions before discharge. When the results of this study were published in Science in 1973, it was a bombshell in the scientific community. The reaction was mostly denial. Many argued that the experiment was an exaggeration. Others attacked David Rosenhan's character. But one research and teaching hospital chose to challenge Rosenhan. They claimed that they could easily identify the fake patients he would send to their hospital over the next 3 months. Rosenhan accepted the challenge. The hospital then declared that of the 193 patients admitted to them in the next 3 months, 41 were definitely fakes, and 42 others were suspected. Rosenhan's response was the biggest troll in the history of science. He had not sent a single fake patient to the hospital in those 3 months. What is going on? Are the sciences that deal with mental illness, such as psychology and psychiatry, undergoing a fundamental shakeup? As he was thinking about this, a question came to his mind. How do we determine whether something is a mental illness or not? That is, where does what we call normal end, and where does abnormal begin? For example, how do you measure a person's level of sadness? The level of peacefulness? And this is where the real problem with mental illness starts. If we cannot determine at what point a person is sad and at what point they are depressed, then the problems that the Rosenhan experiment shows are inevitable. I will come back to the Rosenhan experiment in a moment because it is not that simple. But first, let's look at how it has changed since the 1960s. Because psychology and psychiatry have made great advances in the last 150 years. Therefore, even comparisons only 10 years apart may not be fair. For example, in modern psychology, A mental illness or mental disorder in today's terminology is defined as the presence of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that cause people significant distress and impairment or disruption in their daily functioning. This definition is not very strict. After all, your daily activities may be impaired or disrupted when you are saddened by the death of a loved one. If this bothers you, the death may have left enough of a mark to cause a mental problem. So don't think that nothing can happen to me. Unexpected events can sometimes disturb your mental health. However, apart from such short-term cases, usually for a problem to rise to the level of mental illness, it must be persistent. That is, it must not go away easily, or it must be of a recurrent nature. This is not enough. Today there are catalogs such as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association or the International Classification of Diseases published by the World Health Organization. These books describe in detail what kinds of symptoms and subcategories disorders can have. Such standardization efforts aim to prevent anyone from making a diagnosis on their own. Because for healthcare to be reliable, there needs to be some consistency. Patients should receive the same diagnosis and treatment no matter which institution they go to. This is, of course, not as easy as it sounds. After all, medicine is an art as well as a science. Technologies like MRI machines and the ability to precisely measure blood levels have greatly improved scientific work. However, accurately interpreting the patient and symptoms, determining the best treatment, and effectively handling unknown cases that may arise during treatment are still very important. When your patient is dying of an unknown cause, you cannot gather hundreds of talents, divide them into different groups, give some of them a placebo, and conduct a controlled experiment to analyze the results. So, the scientific method may not always come to your aid. You need to make the best decision with the information at hand. This is the specialty or craft side of the job. Therefore, it is very important for both physicians and patients to seek the opinion of other physicians when necessary. However, the effort to achieve a certain standardization and categorize diseases, symptoms, and treatments points to the scientific nature of medicine, psychiatry, and psychology. Modern medicine draws its strength from academic research, case reports, and controlled experiments. If you go to the hospital today and they don't try to clean your blood with leeches or smoke out the evil spirits that are believed to possess you, it is thanks to the hard but determined progress of science. Yes, there are still many problems to be solved in medicine: discrimination, data gaps, socioeconomic inequalities. But we have also made great progress, and the most important milestones in this progress are the lessons we have learned from mistakes made. The existence of studies like the Rosenhan experiment is not a source of embarrassment, but is fully in line with the principle of self-criticism and self-improvement in science. If we really want to get to the most accurate and best results, we have to resolve any shortcomings and mistakes. However, the Rosenhan experiment may not have actually yielded as big and shocking results as initially portrayed. Unfortunately, science narrators are not very good at this. They cover the most interesting parts of scientific topics and ignore the scientific debates that follow. These discussions are usually the more boring parts that make the subject less interesting. But the real science, the real valuable information is hidden in these discussions. I don't want to tell you scientific stories here. I want to help you reach a level where you can at least reasonably understand the debates in a field. For example, most of the viewers of this video have seen other videos about the Rosenhan experiment. It has been covered on many local and international channels and will be covered hundreds of times in the future. However, most of those who have heard of the Rosenhan experiment have not heard of Susanna Cahalan's book, The Great Pretender, published in 2019. In this book, Cahalan begins to investigate who were the 7 famous fake patients of David Rosenhan, who passed away in 2012. His goal is to interview them and uncover the background of the experiment. Because in large psychology experiments, the methodology has to be very clear in order to verify the results. However, in academic papers, these methods are often treated superficially. For example, you can open the paper and read it, but the potential exaggerations and inaccuracies can be hidden. I will explain this to you sometime with examples from the famous Stanford prison experiment. If you don't want to miss this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Cahalan accesses all of Rosenhan's experimental documents and analyzes each and every one of them. His findings are quite disturbing. It seems that Rosenhan has truncated a lot of data in order to support his already predetermined conclusions. For example, Cahalan was able to identify only 2 out of the initial 8 fake patients, even though he examined all the records of the experiment. And one of them was Rosenhan himself. The other person is a medical student named Henry. The occupations and genders of the other 6 people are alleged, but their identities are unknown. Cahalan suspects that they may have been fabricated by Rosenhan. For example, during his investigations, Cahalan also learned that there was a 9th fake patient who was initially told that he would participate in the experiment. This person, however, received excellent care and was not mistreated in the hospital where he was admitted with faked symptoms. Since this experience did not match Rosenhan's narrative, he excluded this person from the experiment. Most sources do not give all the perspectives that should be given about these experiments. For example, imagine that if you drank a liter of blood and went to an emergency room and asked for help by vomiting blood, the doctors would consider you a patient with peptic ulcer and admit you. If you didn't say afterwards that it was a joke, which Rosenhan didn't say, he just said that his symptoms had gone away. I'm not vomiting blood anymore, I'm fine. Would they just let you go? No, they wouldn't. If you insisted, they would make you sign a document that you refused treatment and left the hospital voluntarily, even if it was not medically advisable. Why? Because the moment you come to that hospital, you are now the responsibility of those doctors. For example, what if you really have a stomach bleed and you drop dead the day you leave the hospital? Or what if someone pretending to be mentally ill really has mental problems that cause them to become aggressive, and the day they are released they hurt someone? Of course, we should not overdo it here. These people have been treated horribly, ostracized, subjected to electroshock therapy without their consent, had blood drained from their bodies, and have even been hanged or burned to death. To this day, Hollywood movies continue to portray mental illness as incurable and irreversible aberrations. This was one of the criticisms of the Rosenhan experiment. None of the fake patients were discharged as cured. They were all discharged labeled in schizophrenia remission, which is a very disturbing label. But the picture has changed dramatically since Rosenhan's time. Since then, the medical model of psychiatry has developed, suggesting that many episodes of mental illness have physiological causes and that these causes can be treated medically and sometimes permanently. This paradigm shift led to the discovery that dementia, irritability, and many other mental disorders can be caused by advanced syphilis infection. People who had previously been labeled insane and locked up in cells were now treated in hospitals like other patients, and their symptoms could be treated. Another model was then developed, called the biopsychological model. According to this model, everything psychological has a biological basis and is therefore affected by everything that biology is affected by. Therefore, psychological and psychiatric illnesses should not be treated by simply giving medication or isolating patients from the outside world. Psychological factors such as stress, trauma, perceptions, and memories, biological factors such as evolution, genes, brain structure, and chemistry, and sociocultural factors such as societal roles, expectations, definitions of normality and illness should be considered together. And yes, psychiatry and psychology is a field where we see a wide variety of diagnoses and treatments, because the way illnesses manifest themselves, their details and symptoms vary so much from person to person. The drugs and methods used may not be effective for everyone, but don't forget that there are currently 264 million people worldwide suffering from depression, 45 million with bipolar disorder, 50 million with dementia, and 20 million with schizophrenia and other psychoses. Thanks to the methods and findings that psychology and psychiatry have developed over the years, most of these illnesses can be managed and treated. Therefore, by using phrases such as "this medicine does nothing," "this illness is not real," "I went to a psychologist, I did not see any benefit," or sharing such hasty generalizations on social media, you are putting a barrier between patients who can benefit from that medicine or specialist and their treatment. You should know this. You also have a share in the lack of treatment in this situation. See you in the next video. Goodbye.